The Naval Academy Museum presents A History of the Navy in 100 Objects.
This week, we marked the annual observance of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, remembering the many accomplishments of the great civil rights leader. The day afterwards, much of the East Coast was blanketed by a winter storm. So it makes sense that we overlay these two events and go back to the Navy's storied history in polar exploration to look at an early African-American polar explorer. Our object today is a collection of metal containers that were left behind in a rock cairn during Commander Robert Peary's 1906 attempt to reach the North Pole. We are now joined by Dr. Scott Harmon, retired director of the Naval Academy Museum, for a little bit more about our collection of objects and the subject of our episode today.
In this case, it is a little bit different. It's not a warlike object. It's not related to combat. The United States Navy has had a long history of exploration in the polar areas, and of course today involvement in the missions to the moon and the exploration of space. But beginning in the 1840s, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes led an exploration of the Pacific and the Antarctic area. And later, in the early 20th century, Commander Robert Peary got interested in exploring the Arctic areas and was interested in reaching the North Pole. And he led several expeditions to reach the pole. As a member of all of these expeditions was an interesting gentleman, Matthew Henson. Matthew Henson was not acknowledged very much at the time because he was black, but he was one of the key people in Peary's explorations. Henson learned to use dog teams to pull the sleds. He learned to speak the native languages, so he was very instrumental. And it is also believed, there is some evidence that Henson was actually the first person to reach the North Pole, preceding Peary himself. But because he was black, he was not acknowledged.
A Maryland native, Matthew Henson was orphaned at a young age, and by age 12 went to sea on the Katy Hines out of Baltimore Harbor in 1878. After 6 years at sea, during which he was tutored by his captain in reading, writing, and navigation, Henson went on to work as a clerk in Washington, D.C. It was there that he met young Robert Peary. Peary and Henson would eventually conduct 8 Arctic expeditions together over a period of 22 years. Their first polar attempt was in 1891, and by that point, Henson was already a world traveler, having been to Japan, Spain, Russia, and Nicaragua. From 1891 to 1909, Peary and Henson made half a dozen attempts to reach the top of the world. They pioneered innovative methods of polar travel, using tools, clothing, and techniques that they learned from the Inuit. It was during their 1906 attempt, aboard the specially designed steamer SS Roosevelt, that our object today was left behind as a memorial and marker. 3 years later, on April 9, 1909, Henson, Peary, and 4 Inuit team members arrived at the coordinates of what they thought was the North Pole. Later research would reveal that although close, the location was not in fact the pole. Nevertheless, the team had come further than ever before. Although Peary was given full credit for his achievements, it would be many years before Henson was recognized for his role in the journey and for arriving before Peary. After his polar exploration days, Henson had little contact with Peary, and in 1919 began working as a messenger at the New York Custom House, a civil service position that was secured for him by a New York City black politician. Slowly, however, recognition for Henson's achievements and service began to arrive. Henson was granted Explorers Club membership in 1937 and was awarded the Congressional Peary Polar Expedition Medal in 1944, followed by the U.S. Navy Medal of Merit in 1945, and eventually a presidential citation in 1954, along with honorary degrees from Morgan State College and Howard University, historically black colleges. Henson died in 1955 and was buried in New York City, and his wife later on buried nearby. However, on April 6, 1988, the remains of Matthew Henson and his wife Lucy were transported to Washington, D.C., and interred in Arlington National Cemetery, near the gravesite of Robert Peary and his wife Josephine. The effort for full recognition had been led by Harvard professor Dr. Alan Counter, and finally provided Henson with the recognition which he so truly deserved.
The Navy's involvement in exploration continued in the later 20th century, later after Peary's explorations in the 1920s and 30s, and by Richard Byrd, who made several expeditions to the South Polar area. So the Navy's involvement in exploration in the poles with Wilkes and Peary and Byrd and Matthew Henson gave a lot to American understanding of these areas, and it is a tradition of exploration that is continuing to this day. Thank you for joining us.